Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to start creating a project called Web Services Fun. Web Services Fun is going to be an app that uses web services. Specifically, it's going to use what's called a REST API, which stands for Application Programming Interface, in order to fetch interesting photos from Flickr. If you haven't heard of Flickr before, no worries. I have Flickr.com pulled up right here. Essentially, it's a community for photographers. It has some really beautiful photos, which you can take a look at if you head over to flickr.com/explore, which shows interesting photos that change daily. So here are some beautiful, interesting photos that we can fetch using the Flickr API and display in our app. In order to follow along, you will need an API key, which you can get from flickr.com/services/API/miscellaneous overview.html, which is essentially the overview of the Flickr API. It says the Flickr API consists of a set of callable methods and some API endpoints. You will need an API key in order to call these API endpoints, so you can follow this link right here, flickr.com/services/API/keys, in order to get your API key. Let's take a look at the app. When the app first launches, it's going to fetch about 100 or so interesting photos from one of the Flickr API endpoints called Interestingness List. And then it'll display the first one, and there'll be a floating action button, which we can use to flip through interesting photos. So we'll see the title, the date taken, and the photo. While the photo is being fetched, we will see an indeterminate progress bar, which is going to be a circular spinner. We'll also see a snack bar message saying fetching next photo. So these images that I'm fetching here are truly the images from Flickr Explorer. You can see here. So let's get started. I have an overview of some warm-up tasks that we're going to follow in order to get the project set up. And then from there, we will start writing a bunch of code to create our URL for the request, to get a JSON response back from the request, and then to parse the interesting photo information out of the JSON data. And then, of course, to display some of that information in our app. So let's start with task 0. Create a new basic activity template called Web Services Fun. The basic activity template is nice because it gives us this floating action button here and a little bit of starter code. So let's do Android Studio, new project, basic activity. We will name this activity project Web Services Fun. Over the years, the basic activity template has grown. It now includes some basic support for fragments, which are like mini activities. We don't need fragments for this project. So one of the first things that I'm going to do is delete the fragment code just to keep our project simple. So you'll see under com.whatever your package name is, .web services fun, there's main activity plus first fragment and second fragment. So right off the bat, I'm going to delete first and second fragment. We don't need them. In main activity, there's some code that sets up a navigation controller for use with the fragments. We don't need it, so I'm also going to delete that. And there's a callback on support navigate up that we also don't need that I'm going to delete. If you expand the layout directory, there's also fragment first and fragment second, which belong to those fragments that we deleted. We can delete those as well. And the last thing we need to delete is heading over to content-main.xml. If we look at the XML code for content-main.xml, there is a fragment in our constraint layout, which we do not need. So let's delete that. And now let's run our basic activity template with all of the fragment stuff stripped out. Here it is. We have no content in our constraint layout, and we have this floating action button, which is also called a fab, F-A-B, and it has a little email icon. We'll want to replace this with a little next icon to let the user know they can click this button to flip to the next photo. If we click it out of the box, we get this behavior where a snack bar that says replace your own action is displayed, and it nicely animates moving the fab up. So let's just make a few little cosmetic changes here, and then we'll get started with the bulk of what we're here to do, which is working with an API. So first, if we go to activitymain.xml, here's where our floating action button is defined. I'm going to change it from IC dialog email for its drawable icon to IC media next. I'll zoom in here so you can see what it looks like. This nice little next icon is now being displayed here. And by the way, with the basic activity template, activitymain.xml now uses what's called a coordinator layout. And you can see we get a bunch of boilerplate code in our coordinator layout, including an app bar layout, a toolbar, and the floating action button. The key line of code here is include layout, layout content main. This is where, as you can see in this little preview over here, the bulk of our screen layout is defined. So it's essentially taking what we were doing all in one file and breaking it across two files in order to add support for this coordinator, app bar, and toolbar layout. So content main.xml, this is where we have our constraint layout, and we'll start adding our views, which will be two text views, one for the title of the image, one for the date taken of the image, and then an image view, one for displaying the image source itself. Before we do that, let's head over to main activity and see where we have our floating action button, the FAB right here. The FAB has an on-click listener with an on-click method. So this callback executes whenever the floating action button is pressed. So here's where the snack bar, which is like a toast, is being displayed. So it says replace with your own action. What we're going to say is fetching next photo. So whenever the user presses the fab, they'll see fetching next photo in the snack bar. And then we'll also show a little indeterminate progress bar, which is that circular spinner looking thing. That'll let the user know, hey, we are working on something, which is fetching that next photo. Now let's head over to Android manifest.xml. Before we forget, we will need to add a permission here for using the internet in order to fetch this content from an API. So let's add uses permission, and we'll add the Android permission for internet. This isn't considered a dangerous permission request, so we won't need to prompt the user to get their explicit permission, but we do need to put this in our manifest to declare that we are going to be using the internet in this app. All right, let's head back over to contentmain.xml, and here we are going to set up our layout. Our layout is pretty simple. Let's add two text views and an image view. This first one will be for the title. Give it an informative ID. Just put title in for some placeholder text here. And I'm going to make the appearance for this text view large, so it displays a little bit bigger. I'll do the same thing for date taken. Next, I'm going to add my image view. It already has a nice ID. I will change its scale type to fit center. That way, no matter what the aspect ratio is for these interesting photos that we're going to be downloading, it won't get skewed. It'll just fit it in the center based on its aspect ratio. So let's have title, date taken, and our image view all be essentially constrained to the parent start and the parent end. I'm not going to put any layout margin around the image. The image view should fill all the available horizontal space, so I'm going to set its width to be match constraint. And now I'm going to take my image view, my date taken text view, and my title text view, put them in a vertical chain. And now the last thing I'm going to do is specify that this image view should fill all the available vertical space. And now everything is fully constrained, and we are ready to head over to main activity and start writing some code. I'll make my font nice and large here. So in onCreate, here's the game plan for main activity. Essentially, what we need to do is we need to, in onCreate, fetch a list of interesting photos from the Flickr API. And I'm putting interesting photo in capital I, capital P, casing to denote that this is going to be a type. We are going to define an interesting photo type, and then we truly will have a capital L list of interesting photos. Once we have the interesting photos, then we will display the first one, and we will set it up so that our floating action button will flip to the next photo in the list on click. So on fab click, flip through the photo list and download the current interesting photos bitmap. So we make our initial request to the API. We're just going to get information on the interesting photos, like their title, date taken, and a URL. We won't actually use that URL to fetch the source photo image until we flip to that photo in the list with a floating action button next. So this is the game plan. In order to start working on one, we'll need to learn a little bit more about the Flickr API. So back to the warm-up tasks, we're on task 3. So we've already taken a look at the featured interestingness photos on Flickr Explorer. That's these beautiful photos of the day right here. Next, if you're interested, you can read this post about what interestingness is. You can take a look at it if you want to know more. It's essentially an algorithm that ranks the photos based on how interesting they are, and the most interesting photos end up on the Explore page. Next, let's read the Flickr API overview. So here's the overview. We saw this earlier. If you haven't already made your API key, you'll want to do that now. So on this page, it's giving us an endpoint, which is essentially the base URL for all of the API requests that we're going to make. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to create a new Java class called Flickr API for wrapping all of our Flickr API operations. At the top here, I'm going to declare some static final strings. The first one will be to represent the base part of our URL for making our requests. And I'm going to add /rest on the end here since we'll be using the REST API. Next, we will add our API key as a final string variable. I'm going to note before I do this that this is generally considered bad practice to put your API key as a string in your code, mainly because doing this is risky, because if you say push this code to GitHub, someone could steal your API key if your repository is public, or let's say your API key changes and you have your API key essentially compiled down into your APK or your executable. It's very difficult to change. It's better to put this in, say, an environment variable, or to fetch this from a server or store it in a file that's encrypted. These are all different ideas for better ways to store your API key rather than here in your source code. But we just want to get started with web services fun, so we'll do this, but I just want to emphasize that it generally is considered bad practice. I'll paste mine in here in a moment. Let's also add a tag. That way, when we write things to Logcat, we can easily find them. Next, we're going to need a reference to main activity, so we can do things like find view by ID, so that we can essentially call main activity methods when we have content available, like when we have the list of interesting photos, etc. So here's a constructor for Flickr API. It's just going to take a reference to main activity and set the field of the class main activity to be that object reference parameter. Next, let's define a method called fetch interesting photos. The purpose of this method is to initiate the request to fetch the interesting photos and then later parse the response. So how fetching content from the web works is typically with a REST API or the like, you need a URL to initiate the request. This is exactly what happens when you open, say, your favorite web browser like Chrome and you type in google.com or github.com. You have a URL for your GET request for content, and your content comes back in HTML format, which is then rendered by your browser. Well, we want JSON content to represent our data and not HTML, because we want essentially the data, not necessarily the visible content that a web browser wants. So I've got a little diagram here of how APIs work. At a high level, you have your app and it wants to make a request to a website or some service running on a server. So you have to read the documentation, just like we're going to do with a Flickr API, to see how to construct this request. So we'll figure out how we need to format our URL to get what we want, which is interesting photo information. The server is going to take that request, parse it, make sure that it all looks good. For example, we have a valid API key, etc. And then it's going to make a request to its database to grab the content we want, structure it back in the format we want, which will be JSON, and send that back via response, which our app will then have to parse in order to grab the data that we want, put it into a format we can work with, which will be an interesting photo object list, and then display it in our UI. So at a high level, this is how working with an API works. I've got here an example of an API request. As we start to construct our Flickr URL, this will be helpful just to get familiar with the different parts of a URL. So URLs start with a protocol, typically HTTP or HTTPS. The S is for secure. Usually, if at all possible, you want to use HTTPS for your protocol so that you have endpoint-to-endpoint encryption. Then you have a subdomain, possibly, and a domain. So this is an example making a request to an iTunes API, which is represented by itunes.apple.com. So our base URL we already grabbed right here. So the subdomain is API, and the domain is flickr.com. So api.flickr.com will be the equivalent subdomain or domain for our request. And then we have a path to our particular endpoint on a server that's listening for requests. So for us, this is going to be a path to services/REST. And then the query string starts with a question mark, and this is where we can put in essentially key value pairs that represent parameters for our request. So we will need to read the documentation to see what we need to put in for our query string in order to parameterize our request. So let's take a look at all the different methods that are available with the Flickr API. Here's a list of API methods. There are a lot of them. We're going to scroll down to interestingness and look at flickr.interestingness.getList. So this is the endpoint method that we want to use in order to get a list of interesting photos for the most recent day or a user-specified date. We'll use the most recent day, which will be today. So for this particular method, here's all of the arguments we potentially have to supply, like API key. See how this is required. We have to provide this as a key in our query string for our URL. And then we've got some optional date, extras, per page, and page arguments. We will set extras because we want to get some extra information for each return interesting photo record. For example, we're going to grab date taken, and we'll grab also URL, specifically URL_H, which is going to be a URL to a source image for the interesting photo that's longest side is 1600 pixels. I've had pretty good luck with URL_H. There are a lot of options here for different URLs, which you can take a look at in the URLs documentation if you're interested. So let's start working on constructing our URL. I'm going to write a method. So our URL is going to start with the base URL. And then we are going to add our key value pair parameters as part of our query string in order to customize or parameterize our request. So let's start by specifying the start of our query string with a question mark, and then that our method we want to call is flickr.interestingness.getList. Pretty easy to misspell that, so I'm probably just going to copy and paste this just to make sure didn't misspell anything there. If we have more than one key value pair in our query string, then the key value pairs are separated by ampersands. So next we're going to add our API key, which I still need to add mine up here. I'm waiting till we scroll a little bit further down like here so that it'll be off screen. It's not good practice to share your API key in a YouTube video like this, so I'm not going to do that. So URL, string concatenate with ampersand to separate this key value pair from the previous one. API_key, this key here, this name must match exactly the documentation. We'll add our API key. Next, there are some additional key value pairs that I know we need to add by reading other pages in the documentation. If you're interested in knowing where these came from, definitely take a look at these resources here. Read these first: developer guide, overview, encoding, and user authentication. And then there's the URL link that I was referring to earlier about the different URLs you can use for getting interesting photo source images. So I read all these, and I know that there are some essentially additional key value pairs that we're going to want to include. So this includes format equal to JSON, saying that we want our data to come back in JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation Format. Next, ampersand no JSON callback equal to 1. Essentially what this represents is we're asking for raw JSON. And then the last one are the extras that we saw on the interestingness.getlist documentation page. So this is a comma separated list. We want date underscore taken and URL underscore H. Now we have our string. What we want to do is write this string out to logcat just to make sure that it is properly formatted. And we can test this by taking our URL and pasting it into our favorite web browser's URL bar like Chrome and seeing if we get a nice valid JSON response back. So we'll test it there before we start trying to test it in our code. So let's head over to main activity. Step number 1, and on create, fetch a list of interesting photos. Well, we've started writing code to do this. Notice that fetch interesting photos isn't going to return anything because we're going to set this all up to be asynchronous so that our main UI thread, which is what's running on create right here in main activity, doesn't block waiting for fetch interesting photos to finish because it can take several seconds to get that request and parse the response. So we will later write essentially a callback method that we will call when our interesting photos list is available. Let's try this. Let's open logcat, take a look at our URL. We've got our protocol, our subdomain and domain. We've got our path, the start of our query string. We've got our key value pairs, method, API key, JSON, no JSON callback, extras. Looks good. We can click on it, or we can copy and paste it into the URL bar for our favorite web browser. And it looks like we are successfully getting back JSON. It is pretty long and pretty hard on the eyes. But fear not, what I like to do is copy this and paste it into a pretty printer or install an extension for your web browser that will nicely format this. JSONformatter.org/JSON is one of the first results that show up in a Google search for JSON pretty printer. If you paste your JSON here and then say make pretty, what it does to make it pretty is essentially twofold. One is for all of the nested objects, it's going to use indentation, and then it's got some nice syntax highlighting for integer constants and strings, etc. So essentially what JSON is a dictionary, or AKA a hash map, which is essentially a collection of key value pairs. All keys in JSON are strings. So for example, photos, page, pages, etc. These are all keys. It's easy to know these are the keys because there's a colon right after them, which separates the key from the value. So the key is unique and it maps to a value. The value can be many different types. It could also be a string, which is the case here for an ID. Or let's look at date taken right here. Date taken, title. Okay, these are string keys that map to string values. They can be integers like page and pages. So there are 5 pages of 100 results per page. So we've got 500 total photos. They can also be arrays or lists. For example, photo key maps to this huge 100 item photo array where each element in the photo array is a JSON object, which is also a value that a key can map to in JSON, which is a nested JSON object. So the JSON objects themselves are represented by curly brackets. So here, photo, the key, maps to an array of photo JSON objects. You can see the comma which separates them. So right here, this is all the information for that first image, pull it up again, right here, called Atomic Explored. Atomic Explored. So there's the title right there. Here's the date taken, and here's the URL H. So if I grab this URL H and paste it in Chrome, you'll see that the extension is JPEG. This is truly a unique identifier for the source image right here. Looks pretty cool. So let's close that. And I will stop here in this video and carry on in the next video with creating an interesting photo class to model an interesting photo object whose data we're going to parse out from each one of these JSON objects in the photo array. And we will start doing that JSON parsing in our Flickr API class. That's it for now. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next video.